everybody, welcome back to our weekly 12 Rules for Life video. Today's video is going to be on Rule 10. If you haven't had a chance to check out the earlier rules, you can find them in the Jordan Peterson playlist. So without further ado, I bring you Rule 10. I hope you enjoy. Rule 10 is be precise in your speech. He starts off by examining the way we perceive objects in the world. The example he uses is a laptop computer. At first glance, a laptop is a flat, thin, rectangular object, but it is obviously so much more than that. We perceive the laptop as valuable because of all the countless ways it can come in handy, but even this perception is incomplete and temporary. What we often don't perceive when we look at it is the countless inventions and man-hours it took to create that laptop. We don't consider things like the electrical grid that must be kept running constantly to power the laptop. In this sense, the laptop is just a piece of a much bigger picture. Then, as the years pass, the laptop becomes obsolete and no longer has any value other than the material it's made from. To draw a comparison, he uses the example of a leaf taken from a tree. The leaf can be perceived as its own unique object, but it could never exist without the tree that it came from. Then, after a short while, the leaf withers away and dies. Almost everything we see and hold is like this, although it is not so easy to see. We tend to view the things in the world as tools and obstacles rather than objects. As we discussed in Rule 4, this is rooted in our biology. Vision is a complex process in the brain, and there are almost infinite amount of objects in the world. The brain could never compute all that information, and so we filter out a majority of our surroundings that are basically meaningless to us and use our limited visual perception to perceive only the things that have meaning to us. This is why a chair, a beanbag, and a tree stump all fall into the same category, despite being so different. In each case, they are useful in the same way to us, as being something we can sit down on. We notice clouds because they can rain on us. We see other people's cars as obstacles we must avoid to get to our destination. We look at people's faces because we need to communicate with them. The same concept applies to how we view ourselves. At first glance, our skin is the boundary between what is us and what is the rest of the world. But we extend this boundary all the time. When we use a tool, it becomes part of us. We can actually feel the surfaces of what we are working on through the tool. When we drive a vehicle, the car becomes an extension of our body. We avoid hitting things with it at all costs, and if someone were to hit it, we would feel attacked and take it personally. We also extend this boundary when we watch movies or read books. When we identify with a character, we emotionally react as if it's happening to us. We do this same thing with sports. When we are identified with our favorite teams, we take their wins and losses personally. This can actually be measured biologically as testosterone levels rise and fall depending on whether your favorite team wins or loses. This is also how our children and family become part of us. Losing a child would be like losing a part of yourself. This is why most parents would sacrifice so much to save their child. This ability to identify with other people and things has come about as a result of being social creatures, and it is the basis of how we learn to cooperate with each other. So the world that we perceive is a much simpler version, but just underneath the surface there is a vast interconnected complexity. When things are going well, this simple surface view is enough. It's only when things start to fall apart that we need to take a deeper look at things. If you need to go somewhere, you hop in your car and drive there. On the surface, it is quite simple. You don't need to know how a combustion engine works and all the other mechanical parts of the car to get where you need to go. However, when the car breaks down, we suddenly have to contend with a more complex version of the car. Oftentimes, this involves going to a mechanic who is familiar with those particular complexities. We, however, are happily unaware of the complexity underlying the simple act of driving somewhere until we are forced to be aware when we can no longer get to where we need to go. On a more personal level, this can be seen as well. Take the case of someone who finds out that their partner is cheating on them. At first, the perception of their partner is as it's always been, someone they love and trust and know intimately. Once they become aware of their infidelity, the image of their partner falls apart and they are left with a stranger. Automatically, they question the validity of every interaction they ever had with their unfaithful partner. They start to question their own worth. They may even start to question all relationships in general. It's no wonder this type of betrayal is so hard to overcome. It completely shatters one's perception of the world around them. What are we left with when this perception is shattered? When the order we've worked hard to establish in our life becomes chaos? Symbolically speaking, when this surface view of the world shatters, we slip into the underworld where we must confront the chaos that is so often symbolized by monsters and dragons in our most ancient stories. It is here that we have no choice but to confront the underlying chaos that we have ignored for so long. To explain this concept, he refers to a child's story called "There is no such thing as a dragon." In the story, the child sees a dragon about the size of a house cat in his room. He runs and tells his mother about it, and she quickly tells him there are no such thing as dragons. Every time she says there's no such thing as dragons, the dragon gets a little bit bigger. By the end, the dragon is so big it takes up the entire house and can't be ignored. Finally, the child exclaims that there really is a dragon, and the mother is forced to acknowledge it. As soon as they admit that there is a dragon, it shrinks back down to the size of a cat. How often do we ignore the dragon in our life? We would much rather pretend that everything is fine on the surface rather than acknowledge that things could potentially fall apart. This is how the dragon grows until it can no longer be ignored. In the case of the person who was cheated on, how many times did they take their relationship for granted? How many hundreds of conversations were never had to avoid conflict? This is how bitterness and resentment grow, just like the dragon. Instead of waiting until it grows so big we can no longer ignore it, as is the case with infidelity, we must instead confront it before it can grow out of control. So how do we confront this dragon? Well, we can start by being precise about what we want. Rather than saying, "It's okay, it's not worth fighting about," we should instead have some courage and stop being lazy and have the hard conversation. If it ends up being a fight, then at least it's a fight for peace as a goal. When we rationalize not fighting for what we want in life by saying we are tolerant enough to deal with whatever it is that's bothering us, we are usually biting off more than we can chew, and the monster under the rug gains a few more pounds. Perhaps your relationship isn't as exciting as it used to be. Maybe your sex life has declined. Maybe your life has become boring and you never do much of anything anymore. These conversations are emotionally charged and not easy to have. But we are dealing with stuff that makes life worth living. Isn't that worth fighting for? Love can slowly turn to hate when we do nothing. When we don't notice, don't react, don't attend, don't discuss, don't consider, don't work for peace, and don't take responsibility. Just because you ignore your problems doesn't mean they will go away. Everything clarified and articulated becomes visible. We refuse to specify a problem because that would involve admitting a problem exists. If you clearly define what you want and don't get it, then you know exactly how you'll be hurt. But at least you will learn something from it instead of hopelessly making the same mistakes and wasting precious time. When we refuse to define success, we render success impossible. We do this because if there is no clear picture of what success is, then there is no clear picture of what failure is. This way, when you do fail, you won't notice and it won't hurt. This doesn't work. You cannot be fooled so easily. When life falls apart, in order to pick ourselves up and put ourselves back together, we must thoughtfully articulate our reality. We must acknowledge everything we have ignored in an attempt to avoid being uncomfortable. To avoid falling into a victim mentality and blaming the world for our pain, we must acknowledge our part in our own downfall. We avoid repeating the same patterns by speaking carefully and precisely. We use our speech to sort things out and set a new goal and navigate to it. This process starts by admitting there is a problem to begin with. Only then can we begin to sort out a solution. When we fail to speak up about our problems, we leave them in the realm of our imagination. And most often, what we can imagine is much worse than the reality of the situation. Take, for example, a person who wakes up in pain and starts to imagine all of the potential fatal diseases he could be suffering from. If he didn't speak to a doctor to get a precise diagnosis, he would be left with the worst possible scenarios running through their head, when in reality, it might not be so serious. We cannot shirk the responsibility of confronting the issues in our lives. If we don't confront them as soon as possible when they are still a manageable size, then they will grow until they are completely unmanageable. When you identify things with careful attention and language, you simplify them and detach them from the underlying complexity and chaos. This allows us to live without the anxiety that everything might fall apart. If you leave things vague, the world will become too complex and unmanageable. Say what you mean and act out what you say so you can find out what happens. Pay attention and note your errors, articulate them, and strive to correct them. This is how you find meaning in your life. Use honest and precise speech to confront the chaos of your life and bring it into habitable order. Admit what you want. Tell those around you who you are. Move forward forthrightly. And be precise in your speech.